It's hard to believe people don't sort of investigate all forms of free money they can get.
I think they've really cemented their place in the New Zealand space industry.
He felt fearful for his safety is one of the things that he said.
Also, the union was pressuring construction companies to engage labour hire firms that were linked to the bikies and organised crimes.
News is good. Food prices have fallen for the first time in 6 years.
Hello and welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. I'm Grant Walker, Editor-in-Chief, Strategy. First up, startups can be expensive and risky. We look at alternative ways that startups can access the working capital they need without losing company ownership.
Now, where do you think non-dilutive funding is with the innovation ecosystem we have in New Zealand at the moment?
Yeah, look, it's certainly an attractive form of funding for both startups and scale-ups and established businesses. I think when founders and when businesses are establishing or assessing the funding mix, the three pockets they tend to look at are debt, equity investment through venture investment, or revenue. I think one of the channels that doesn't get assessed as well as it could in NZ is non-dilutive funding, which typically comes from government grants and tax incentives. For example, I think a survey of 5,000 businesses in 2023 that were performing research and development, only half of them were accessing what's called the research and development tax incentive, which is a sort of pretty low-hanging fruit, brilliant, but readily available, innovation tax incentive in NZ. So that probably speaks to perhaps sort of where it ranks.
Right. It's hard to believe people don't sort of investigate all forms of free money they can get. Why do you think there's been a sort of a reluctance to do that?
Yeah, I think it's a cultural and an educational and an awareness issue. So, if we compare New Zealand to sort of Australia or UK or Europe, in those countries, non-dilutive government funding is typically very well utilised. The government does a pretty good job of publicising it, and businesses typically do a great job of sort of being aware of it and accessing it. I think in NZ we're catching up to that. Agencies like Callaghan and other ministries and departments do a good job of making this funding available, but there are hurdles and roadblocks for businesses. Really, I think the knowledge gap in NZ is, am I eligible for this funding? And if I think I am, how do I go about applying for it? So, we're coming along, but there's a long way to go.
NBR often hears that companies are very quick to welcome in venture capital. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, it's sort of down to the individual business, but I think what's important is that whether you're a startup or a scale up, or look, even a very well established business. You should always have a non-dilutive funding strategy. Companies spend months and months and months planning on raising investment, or months talking to banks. They often don't put the same time and resource into looking for grants and tax incentives, which, as you said, is sort of free money. They don't repay it. They don't pay interest on it. They don't have to give any of their business away, to access it.
Of course, venture capital is getting harder to get, perhaps in straitened times. Do you think more people will be looking to non-dilutive funding?
Absolutely, yeah. Look, if I look at Swell in the last 12 months, 50% of our new clients have never accessed any government funding in the past. 30% weren't utilising it well enough, and I think there's many businesses out there. I referenced the survey earlier that are unaware that it exists, but certainly seeing a trend, as you say now, that investment in debt is a little bit harder or more expensive to access, that they're turning to alternative funding streams for sure.
Do you think some people are perhaps put off by thinking it's too hard to apply for a grant?
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, I think that's probably the number one sort of hurdle I think most businesses have. And, look, it isn't easy. Often, especially if you're applying for sort of material amounts of funding, $500,000 or $1 million plus, the process is months, not weeks, sometimes up to a year, but the upside is, a $5 or $10 million grant that's non-repayable, that's non-dilutive. Might take a year to get, but look at what it can do for your business.
Lavinia McMurtry from Cry10, who used to be with Movac, said the US was the hands down the best country for non-dilutive funding, as their program connects to a national economic strategy. What do you think?
Yeah, look. New Zealand has a goal of having R&D spend at 2% of GDP by 2027. We're currently at about 1.4%, so it does have a ways to go. There is a link currently, and I think the link is, you see grant funding and tax incentives in areas, that the government wants to grow its footprint and increase its capability. So, look, I think there is a link. We just, struggle to compete on the scale of the funding and the scope that exists in NZ. Less to go around, I guess, as a way to sum it up. But look, the more the government can do to increase that accessibility and volume of grant funding, the more jobs, the more IP, the more talent we're going to keep in NZ, the more investment we're going to see from overseas investors into NZ businesses. So that there's a definite link there.
Do you think it's targeted enough, though, or is it more or less a scattergun? I mean, yes, all governments have economic goals that they want to achieve, but I mean...
Yeah, I don't mean to sit on the fence, but look, there's some that's highly targeted, extremely targeted at specific technologies, and then there's funding for sector agnostic innovation or sector agnostic projects. That sort of fluctuates. At the moment, as I say, the focus is on funding projects and activities that are going to deliver, high economic benefits, job creation, high export value. Lots of funding in the primary sector for sort of agri and hort, still a bit for clean tech and deep tech, as well as the sector agnostic stuff as well. So
is there anything about what the government does in this area that you'd like to see change?
Yeah, look, I think everyone would want, a more funding to be available, but I think, dealing with what we have at the moment is just greater visibility and awareness that it exists, and trying to condense, like where practically possible, the time frame between applying and being able to utilise the funding. The average time for a sort of $1 million grant is anywhere from 3 months to 12 months. Businesses move very quickly, especially small startups and scale-ups, and they need surety and confidence quicker on whether that funding can be accessed or not.
One company that's succeeding in this area is Dawn Aerospace. As of May this year, it's making more in revenue than the amount of venture capital first invested in the business. Here's Fiona Rotherham with the analysis.
Fiona, why is this milestone important?
Well, in the words of CEO Stefan Powell, it's really means the company's become a real company, if you like. It's got real products, real customers, and hitting that milestone of making more money. They're making just over around $30 billion in revenue at the moment, which is pretty good for a company that's only started in 2017. And so it just feels like they've sort of hit that inflection point where they've established themselves now. It's still risky. They've got a lot of risky business ahead of them. They're developing a space aircraft, a rocket-powered aircraft, which they hope to fly twice daily into space. And they've also got their revenue-making green propulsion systems, their thrusters that help satellites manoeuvre in space. So they've got the two sides to the business, and there is still a lot of risk involved, but I think they've really cemented their place in the New Zealand space industry.
Why is there risk involved when we know companies that are already doing this kind of thing, Rocket Lab, and making a lot of money out of it?
Oh, there's risk in any new technological development. I think the risk is more around the rocket-powered aircraft because no one's done that before. It's a different concept to what Rocket Lab do. But, so there's always that, technological development and the money involved in developing that. It's many millions of dollars.
Sure. So what do the investors have to say about this progress?
So I spoke with Barnaby Marshall. He's a board observer, but he's also a partner with Icehouse Ventures, which is the largest of the venture capital investors in the company. He's really pleased with the growth outcome of the company and how it's going. He said, being in revenue by year 4 is pretty amazing for a company like this, a space transportation company. So he's really happy with how it's going. He said they've built credibility in the market, and that's brought in other investors, made it easier for them to bring in other money.
Are they going for more capital?
Well, companies like this are always raising capital, even though, it has hit profitability, rough profitability now, so it's making more money than it spends. It hasn't been a great environment for raising money, and it still isn't right at the moment, but Barnaby Marshall says that he's pretty confident they'll be able to do a significant raise in the next 18 months. They last raised $20 million in a Series A in late 2022.
Wow. Earlier this month, Dawn got CAA approval to fly its Mark II Aurora space plane at supersonic speeds. What is that, and what's next?
So this is the aircraft they're developing. They've done about 50 test flights under jet and rocket power so far at Glentana Airport in the South Island, and this approval lets them do a new test campaign to take it much higher and much faster, just to see how it goes under those sort of pressures. So the ultimate aim is to fly up to the Kármán line, the edge of space, which is 100,000 metres up. But this will let them go up to 70,000 feet and hit that supersonic speed. It's really iterative testing. So unlike a rocket-powered ship, you kind of have a go and it might explode or it might not. This is really, you boost it each time as you go. And the really good thing about this is if it all goes well, they've already got a lot of interest from commercial customers and wanting to put payloads on that Mark II, which they hadn't expected. They thought that it was going to be the Mark III that interested commercial customers, which is the one that's still in planning stages, which can fly much higher. And so they're planning to do what they're calling a Mark IIB, build that next year, which is the same size sort of aircraft, but much more optimal and much better performance. And they'll use that if they can to get payloads if everything goes well.
Right. And you mentioned the in-space green propulsion, and that's the main revenue engine for the company. How's that side of things going?
It's going really well. I mean, that's the side of things that really brings in the dosh at the moment. They've got about 20 customers and they've got 76 thrusters in space. One of the Achilles heel with their green propellant system, though, has been that it's got a very limited burn time because they use very hot propellants on it. But they've managed to overcome that. They've actually designed a new injector system, and that's getting put into these new B-20 Generation 2s. Obviously, it takes a long time between design and getting things into orbit, so it could be another 18 months to 2 years before they're actually up in space. But they've definitely overcome that problem, and it's that constant iteration that they're doing all the time. They've just got so many development projects. One of the things they're involved in is with a company called Astroforge that's trying to fly up into space and mine minerals, these precious metals up in space. So they're looking to use Dawn's green propulsion system for that.
Amazing. Dawn CEO Stefan Powell wants the New Zealand Space Agency, he says, to act more like NASA and the European Space Agency. What does he mean by that?
So the New Zealand space industry currently is around 1.7 billion. That was the 2019 figure, which is the most recent. But new Space Minister Judith Collins has said she wants to grow it to around 10 billion by 2030. But what Stefan Powell's saying is, well, it's great to have that ambition, but where's the vision that how we're going to, how the space industry is going to impact the wider New Zealand economy and how the government's going to invest to achieve that. Yeah. So, for example, NASA and the European Space Agency, they set up a mission and they say this is what we're going to invest in it, and then they ask companies who can help to come in and put bids in. Whereas, the New Zealand Space Agency, according to Powell, is saying we'll fund your good ideas, but it hasn't come out and said we want to do this. Here's a project you might want to, you could be involved in, and he'd like to see it be more proactive and do the latter.
Is Collins working on something like that? Do you know?
Not that I know of, no.
To employment law we go. Dieter de Boney looks at a case where an employee successfully took a personal grievance against Fonterra after the dairy giant was found to have made unsubstantiated assumptions about an employee's gang affiliations.
So what happened in the most recent event that took it beyond the others?
I think it was probably the culmination of behaviours for Fonterra. The employees who made the complaints in this case, there were two separate employees. One of them felt he was being bullied and harassed and intimidated. and he felt fearful for his safety is one of the things that he said. And then his line manager, as I understand it, was the other person who made the complaint, and that was for failing to do what he was told, essentially. So the line manager was having real difficulty managing this employee and felt there was some insubordination from him. So it was the culmination of those things that led to the investigation by the employer. And I think the employer got to the end of that investigation. Mr. Ormsby had accepted the conduct. He had accepted he said the things that he was alleged to have said. But he disagreed that they were serious misconduct, and he disagreed that he said them in a threatening way, and that he didn't swear, he didn't threaten violence, he was never going to be violent towards anyone.
So that might have been one thing, but then another element came into this case, which was about gang affiliations. Now, explain how that played out.
Sure. Yeah, that's a really interesting part of this case, because it seems that the management at Fonterra for Mr. Ormsby had it in their mind through rumours and other discussions around the workplace, not with Mr. Ormsby, that Mr. Ormsby had gang associations, and whether they were, he had his own links to gangs, or whether they were his friends and the people outside his workplace that he knew were associated with gangs. There was also an incident at a work event where it was said he made a barking noise when someone received an award, and again, that was linked to a gang noise. But none of that was put to Mr. Ormsby in the disciplinary investigation that the employer carried out. So the employer found that there was serious misconduct and terminated Mr. Ormsby. And then when the Employment Relations Authority investigated this matter, the manager who made the decision to terminate Mr. Ormsby, and the manager who made the decision to terminate Mr. Ormsby, and an HR manager gave evidence about these purported gang links. And the authority member, rightly so, said, well, this seems to have been part of your decision making. Was this discussed with Mr. Ormsby? And it appears it was not. So while it came into the decision making, Mr. Ormsby wasn't given a chance to defend himself in relation to those alleged gang links.
Should gang links be part of an employer's deliberation on somebody, or is there a lot of there are ways that must be thought about?
I think being a member of a criminal organisation would certainly be something that the employer would be able to take into account. But just having associates or friends or family who might have those gang links, that might be a bigger stretch to bring into the employment relationship and into part of a disciplinary investigation. But in this case, the alleged conduct was intimidatory and threatening type behaviour. So I think it did have an undercurrent or a relevance in this case.
Right. I mean, if the company had asked him, are you affiliated with a gang, and he said no, that would have covered off their bases? The case might have turned out differently?
I think potentially it could have, because that was one of the key things that the authority found, that the employer had these concerns, and it didn't give Mr. Ormsby a chance to explain himself. And what Mr. Ormsby said to the authority was that absolutely he didn't have any association with gangs. He said he did have associates that many, many years ago were linked, or I think it was family members, were linked to a gang, not the gang that was in question in this case. And he said he has no other links to gangs, and there's no other reasonable explanation why he would.
Right.
One thing that was in the news at the time was another Mr. Ormsby in that area who was linked to the mongrel mob, and had been convicted of crimes, and it mentioned his brothers, but that was no one that the Mr. Ormsby who worked for Fonterra knew or was associated with.
Speaking of gang affiliations, they're also causing problems in Australia. Lachlan Cahoon looks at accusations of corruption and thuggery in the main building and construction union.
Why don't you start by detailing some of these allegations?
Sure. The CFMEU is the Construction, Forestry, Maritime and Energy Union. It's a super union that's created a few years ago, but most of the allegations centre on the construction arm. So there are links to organised crime and essentially to bikie gangs, the Mongols and the Hells Angels. And these bikie members were also union members, and employers, including governments, on big infrastructure projects were pressured into employing these people on six-figure salaries. Also, the union was pressuring construction companies to engage labour hire firms that were linked to the bikies and organised crimes on some of the big construction jobs around Australia. Even though law enforcement were warning the construction companies not to do it, they were pressured into hiring these criminal gangs. So all this goes back to the 80s. When the previous construction union was the Builders Labourers Federation, and that was also deregistered. The union boss at the time was taking kickbacks from construction companies to fund his beach house, and he eventually spent some time in jail. But that wasn't enough. The union then called out its members in an attempt to have him released. So this is something that's been going on in Australia for some time.
Wow, yeah, it's quite a saga. A lot of it centres around a union official named John Setka. Tell me about him.
Yeah, well, Setka was in the BLF, the Builders Labourers Federation. He transitioned into the CFMEU, and he was the head of the Victorian branch for about 12 years. And Victoria was really the centre of the power for the union. So there are lots of allegations against him of intimidation and extortion. He took former Prime Minister Tony Abbott to court after he made allegations about Setka, and Setka lost that case. He was up on blackmail charges, which didn't proceed, but he once again called out the union in mass demonstrations against the charges and claims that they were put up charges. So his wife, who a judge said had been a victim of family violence, was recently found guilty of conspiring to murder Setka. But that conviction was dropped. And more recently, he tried to pressure the Australian Football League, the big football league here, into sacking their umpiring boss. And the umpiring boss, in a previous employment, he was heading up a building tribunal, which the CFMEU didn't like, and had done some stuff that Setka didn't like. So he was calling for the umpiring boss to be sacked. Otherwise, the AFL would face all this action on its building sites, and they're building a lot of stadiums around the country. So, but Setka, a colourful character, he actually resigned his position with the union a couple of weeks ago after these allegations came out.
Wow, there's tendrils going into all aspects of Australian life over there. What are some of the wider implications?
Well, this is the reason I chose this as a subject for the column, Will. I guess it really cuts the links, one of the strongest links between the union movement with the Labor Party. And obviously the Labor Party had its origins in the Labor movement at the turn of the century. And now the Labor government is pursuing action to put some branches of the union into administration. So, and the CFMEU were, through its affiliation, were largely funding the Labor Party in Victoria. I think the amount was worth about $700,000 a year in Victoria alone that the Labor Party were getting from the CFMEU. So cutting that relationship is really symbolic of what's happening with the union movement in Australia, where there has been a big decline in union membership. I mean, in 1992, 41% of the Australian workforce was in a union, and that was down to 12% in 2022, and it's probably fallen more since then. So the nature of work, the working relationships, plus a decline in manufacturing industries, which used to employ a lot of unionists, has really seen a decline in union power in the political sense. But in economic sense, it's segued into the superannuation industry. Australia has $3.9 trillion in assets under management in superannuation. About 1/3 of that is linked to industry super funds, which trace their origin to the union movement. So while union membership is falling, union control over capital, over funds, has increased. And superannuation funds own about 40% of the shares on the ASX. And that's tipped to increase to about 60% by 2040. So it's kind of segued from direct economic action into into financial power over the capital markets. And that's the big change that we've seen.
That's fascinating. Are there any other political implications?
Yes, there are. I mean, what's happened in the last few years is I mentioned the way that Labor has grown apart from the union movement, but they've also grown apart from their traditional working class support. I mean, today the typical Labor Party support is urban professionals in the inner city, progressive people who are on the centre left of politics, whereas the opposition, the coalition led by Peter Dutton, once upon a time they were the champion of business people and large business, but that has changed completely. So they are now pursuing a much more populist line. So someone who was once a union member and a Labor supporter is now a sole trader or runs a micro business on a contract, and they're much more likely to be supporting the Liberal Party. So we've seen a real flipping of the script in terms of politics as well as these changes have come through.
Finally, some good news. Inflation is slowing down faster than expected. In this week's Economy Matters, our columnist Christoph Schumacher analyses what this will mean for the OCR.
Christoph, thanks for joining us. You've talked about quite excellent news.
Absolutely. For the first time in a very long time, we've heard that inflation has fallen by more than what we expected. The Reserve Bank was hoping for 3.6% of inflation, the banks 3.5%, and what we got was 3.3%. So it's like we've done better than what was expected. So that's always good news.
And there was euphoria.
Absolutely. Markets responded very quickly with wholesale rates because they've now put about a 50% chance of inflation. The OCR already falling in the August announcement. The banks were not quite that optimistic, but said October is very much on the cards, definitely November. So this is quite different from what we heard a couple of months ago when the Reserve Bank even indicated there could be a rise in the OCR or definitely keeping it where it is for longer. So there's certainly a lot of euphoria about something happening to the OCR very, very soon.
Do you think the actual story has changed? Will there be cuts, and are they imminent?
Good question. I'm not quite as optimistic as the market and the banks. Yes, news is good. Food prices have fallen for the first time in 6 years. That's excellent news. If you go to the supermarket, vegetables, fruit, a big drop. We see meat products, fish. Petrol prices have fallen compared to a year ago. So that's all good. It just hurts the wallet less when you go shopping. However, there's a lot of products which actually have gone up in prices. Eating out is more expensive, takeaways are more expensive. So while products that are exposed to international markets, our tradable inflation is very, very low, only 0.3%. Our non-tradable inflation still sits at a whopping 5.4%. So these are all our domestic services. And if you recall, Adrian Orr made it very clear that he won't change the OCR unless our domestic inflation is falling as well, and that hasn't really happened.
So what emphasis from now on will the Reserve Bank put on that non-tradable domestic component?
It's a tricky part because what has really gone up in price, like 14% to last year, are insurances. If you look at it, we now pay actually twice as much for the same policy as we paid in 2009. Rates have gone up, rents have gone up. So what we save at the supermarket, we pay more for our living. But these things are very hard to control. How does the Reserve Bank influence the rates we are charged or rents we are charged? So it's a tricky situation for the Reserve Bank. On one side, tradable inflation has fallen by a considerable amount, and with 3.3% overall inflation, we are very close to the 1 to 3% target band of the Reserve Bank, but it hasn't managed to get that non-tradable inflation down. So it'll be interesting to see what the Reserve Bank will do. There's also another component. There are 3 more OCR announcements left, August, October, and November. But the next inflation values come out after the October OCR announcement. So what you would expect the Reserve Bank to do is make an announcement on the OCR without having our latest inflation values. And that could be a risk the Reserve Bank might not like to take.
Do you think that needs to be corrected? Should the inflation data come out before?
Yes, if you look at it, it would make sense for the inflation numbers to be available before the Reserve Bank has to make a change or a decision on the OCR. It's, again, our revision mirror driving experience that the Reserve Bank has to look into the past in order to make a decision that impacts on the future, which I find quite challenging. Absolutely, Australia has shifted to more regular inflation values, so it's a bit unfortunate that we still take so long to get out new values, and especially that the announcement comes straight in the week after the OCR decision.
Yeah, so the Reserve Bank either could push back a couple of weeks too, to later.
Exactly. I mean, there is the final announcement in November, so maybe the Reserve Bank might just wait to get the latest inflation values and then make a more informed decision later on. But the banks still put hope on an earlier announcement, but we'll just wait and see. It's a prediction that nobody's probably comfortable to make.
That's all for this week. We appreciate you watching, and remember, the place for all your business news, nbr.co.nz.